So welcome back. This is the second in our series on integrative preaching. I'm Kent Anderson, and I'm trying to help you to think about how to preach in an integrative way. If you are watching this video, that means you probably watched the first one, which sketched out the model of integrative preaching. I'm always encouraged when people come back for more, so thank you. We're talking now about the tools of integrative preaching. We summarized those before, but we're going to go into a little more detail now. Tools are helpful things. They allow us to achieve other purposes. I have a hard time hammering a nail with just my bare hand. But if I have a hammer, it's going to be a lot more effective. Of course, there's a lot of things I could do with a hammer more than just banging a nail. I could pry things, I could push things, I could break things, I could do all sorts of things with a hammer. That's one tool, but there's lots of ways to work with that tool to achieve various purposes that we might have in mind. So we have these four tools, and they all have different purposes, but you exerting your own personality and your own gifts will be able to utilize these tools in all sorts of ways to achieve the purposes that God would lead you to as you try to lead others in listening to His Word. So we're going to take the four tools one at a time. I'd suggest to you that these four tools pretty much cover the landscape. Like they pretty much serve you in terms of every possible function that you could think of when it comes to preaching. As I said, there's lots of different ways to use the tools, but these four in basic form are going to be what you need. You can think of it like a hammer, a saw, a screwdriver, and I don't know, a chisel or something like that. Those four things are going to be all you need. So here's our model again. You saw this in the first video, and we're going to be thinking specifically about the things that happen in the gaps here between the polar axes. So we have head and heart, we have heaven and human, and in between here we have the pieces that integrate these two concerns, that bring head and human together, that bring heaven and head together, heaven and heart, heart and human. And we'll see how that works as we move along. The four tools then, we mentioned before, problems, points, prayers, and pictures. So let's take them one at a time, beginning with problems. Everybody's got a problem. You know that if you lived in the world any length of time. We all have challenges, especially when we're dealing with the Word of God, as we're trying to respond to God, as we're trying to believe God, obey God. It's challenging because we're called to be people who work a different way, who live a different kind of life than what is common in the world. And that means we're going to struggle. We're going to struggle with what we find in the world. We're going to struggle with what we find in the Word. And that's where preaching can help us. As we hear the voice of God by His Spirit through His servant, we find the help that we need. This is pastoral work, the work of encouragement that happens as preachers work with their listeners. So here we are in this quadrant here on the bottom left-hand side of the model. We're bringing together head and human, the cognitive and the subjective, and we're thinking in terms of solving problems in the mode of the pastor. That's what we're doing here. This is the first tool, learning to work like a pastor as you preach. So there's lots of things that could be said about this. I'm just going to give you very quickly several ideas that you can work with. The first is when you're thinking about pastoral work or working as on the problem, you've got to meet your listeners. You've got to know who they are. You've got to understand what makes them tick, what they care about, what they don't care about, what they're interested in, what they're not interested in. And all kinds of people, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, and every other permutation in between. All kinds of people. You need to know them, understand them, and realize what kind of problems that they might be experiencing. You need to locate the conflict. Whenever you're working with a particular theme or a particular text, there's a place where it's going to be difficult, where it's going to stick, it's going to sting, it's going to rub. Where is that conflict? What is it needs to be overcome? You need to overlap the stories. You need to be looking at what God is saying in terms of His story, what's going on in the biblical text, the people in the text itself, and what they were dealing with, what kind of problems they had, and ourselves. as people in the 21st century. What do we care about? What are we struggling with? And you put those one over top of the other, and you find that place in the middle where it all connects. And that's a great place to focus on as you're preaching. You want to find a particular angle into this sermon. Like what direction do you want to look at this from? What point of view? What perspective? Because if you come at it from different sides, different perspectives, different ways of thinking, you'll see that problem in different ways. So think about that as you're preaching. You need to hear the opposition. It's one thing to have a particular concept or an idea, but you want to look at it from the other side. You want to understand what the people who are really struggling with this might be thinking. Don't just make it easy. Don't just quickly move to solutions, but let the problem live a little bit. Let's hear why this is so difficult. Not just knocking down straw men, but going deep inside what's going on in the heart of the listener to know what is really standing in opposition to the truth that we want to proclaim. So the problem. These are various ways by which we try to wrestle with things that deeply challenge the listener to hear from God and respond faithfully to Him. Then we have points. And this is us working as theologians, thinking things through, helping people to sort out the intellectual content of the gospel and understand the truth. We're working here at the intersection between heaven and the head. By heaven, we're talking about the objective side of things, the things from God's perspective. And here we're talking about cognitive understanding, thinking things through clearly, reasoning things out accurately, and so that we get the point, and that, as Paul said to Timothy, we cut it straight. So this is our work as pastoral theologians. We've got to figure out how it is that we can work as theologians in the preaching that we do. So there's several things here that could be said. Obviously, we need to read the text and take it seriously. We need to really understand what the Bible itself is saying to us. Secondly, we've got to exegete the text. We've got to get it right. We got to know how it works grammatically and structurally, so that we understand what it's actually saying and not just what we want it to say. You don't necessarily need to know how to diagram Greek sentences, but you do need to be able to cut it straight. We need to notice the theology. Like, look for what it is that the text is saying to us about God, about His purposes, about the big things that God is doing across time to reconcile humanity to Himself. Where's the gospel in this text or in this theme? We need to do the research. That means digging deep, studying, reading the commentaries, getting into the details of the text so that we bring something that is substantive to the people that we're working with. We need to command authority. There are various levels of authority that a sermon can have. When you think in terms of the ladder here, you can have direct biblical authority where what the text teaches is exactly what your sermon preaches. Or you could move down the ladder in ways that are a little more about opinion or that sort of thing. So what you want to do is claim as much authority as you can so that what you are offering is exactly what the text is offering. I love to try to find the surprise as we're looking into the text. Find something that maybe we didn't expect, something about God that opens our eyes, that makes our heart swell, that gets our blood pumping, something really fascinating, something different than what you would normally hear in the world. And the Bible is full of those kinds of treasures and gifts. Finally, what we want to do is lead the listener. We want to take them from where they were to the place that they are going. That is to say that we want to move them from a problem way of thinking to a theologically informed solution way of being, so that they understand something they didn't understand before. They're better equipped now to respond in ways that are in keeping with what God has in mind. The third tool is prayer. And this might surprise you a little bit. We don't often think about that as, we don't often think about prayer as a tool or as an aspect of the preaching that we do. But I think it is. I think prayer is more than just those words that we say at the end of the sermon, kind of tacked on as a way of closing things off and making sure the worship team has time to get onto the platform. Prayer is much more than that. What we're describing here is the way by which, in our preaching, we bring people into the presence of God such that they are led to worship. Preaching needs to lead in worship. We don't just want to cede that ground to the guitar players. I am a guitar player. I love leading worship through the vehicle of song. But I also love to lead people in worship through the vehicle of preaching as we draw people into the presence of God. So here we're talking about a tool that lives at the intersection of heaven and heart. Now, we're starting to think affectively about the things that we have realized objectively. And so this is prayer. This is preaching in the mode of the worship leader. And there's several things that could be said about that. First, we want to recognize the presence of God himself. Remember when we read in the first video from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1, that great verse starts like this: in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus. And then it goes on to say, I give you this charge, preach the word. We experience this calling in the presence of God. In other words, preaching is not just about understanding God. It's about meeting God, which is why we are using that word invocation. We're going to meet God, which means we need to talk to God. We need to communicate with him. So the place to start here is to recognize that we are present with him in this act of preaching. We need to confess the conviction. So we've learned something about God theologically that responds to a problem that we've been experiencing in our life. Now what? What do we need to say to God? Do we need to thank him? Do we need to apologize to him, confess to him, bow before him, appreciate him? What is it that we as a group of people together need to say to God because of what we've heard from God? We need to clear some space for this. I'm actually right now going through the process of moving my house. And sometimes what you got to do in order to get things is you got to clear the space. You just got to move everything out. You got to pick it up and take it out the door so that there's room for something else. We actually have to give time for this attitude of prayer to exert itself in our preaching. It needs some room. It means you can't just go from the top of the sermon to the bottom of the sermon, flat out instruction. We need to create some space in the sermon so that we can actually meet God and be responsive to him in the space of the sermon. We need to own the impact. And that is to say that whatever it is that God is doing through this sermon is something that he's doing in me as a preacher. Remember that preaching is leading and listening. And I'm the first listener. I just had the advantage of a head start. And so now I'm going to take you on that same journey. I have to own it first, but having owned it, now I'm going to help you as a listener own that also. I'm going to try and speak with the voice of a listener. That means it doesn't always have to be the voice of the preacher. It doesn't always have to be me talking to you as a preacher. I can use your voice, our voice, as listeners together. Oh, God, help us. God, forgive us. God, love us. Have mercy on us. This is speaking from the perspective of the listener, with the listener's voice. The fourth tool, then, is pictures. And some of us are great at the use of using language to express visually what it is that God is doing. And this is preaching in the mode of the prophet, who is able to articulate a vision of where God wants us to go and what he wants us to do in the world as a result of what we've heard. We're talking here now at this point of intersection between the heart and the human. the subjective world where we live, and the heart, the motivational side, the stuff inside us that moves the will to be different. And so the prophet here paints a picture of a different way of being in the world that inspires us, that compels us, that pushes us forward, not just to worship God, but to serve Him in a powerful way. So a few things about that. We need to see the possibilities. As a preacher, we need to be able to get a picture of what it is that God has in mind. How would the world look different because we've heard what God is saying here by His Spirit and we've actually done something with it? How does that change things? Can we see that? Can we paint that picture? To find an example. Maybe there's somebody you know, somebody in your church, somebody in the world, somebody in life that you could describe that offers a great example of the kind of picture that you're trying to paint for people, the thing that you're challenging them to. Give an example of that in the life of somebody else. Remember your own history. Go back into your life and find a time, a moment, a situation where this was a really big deal that God was doing in your heart or your life. Maybe that moment was very, very recent. And you can bring that to the forefront of your own heart and life as you think about how to share that with others. Project the mission of God in the world. What is it that God is doing? What does He want to see done? And how does this sermon, this piece, play into that big thing that God is doing across time to reconcile humanity to Himself? Reject the alternative. There's always another side. There's something that gets in the way. Identify that, see it, and reject it. Overcome it if you can. Help your people overcome it. Advance the hypothetical. You know, one of my pet peeves about preaching is so often it's about some other time and some other place. When we get around to this particular situation, we could pull out our sermon notes and do something with it if we ever remembered. But most of the time, that other time and place never comes. Well, preaching doesn't have to be hypothetical. It can be about right here, right now, this moment in the presence of God. What do we need to do? Who do we need to call? Should we send a text asking somebody for forgiveness? Is there something we need to commit to do right here, right now, before we ever leave the building? So when I think about integrative preaching, I think about a preaching that's holistic, that's healthy, that's fully nutritional. When I was growing up, my mother had a picture kind of like this attached to our refrigerator. And it was a reminder that we needed to eat a healthy meal from the 4 food groups. You know, your meats, your dairy, your vegetables, and I forget the 4th one, probably chocolate, something like that. We had to eat a balanced or integrated meal that included the 4 food groups. And so I like to think of preaching that way as well. We're going to teach them things that respond to problems. We're going to make points that help them understand God. We're going to lead them in prayer, lead them in worship, and we're going to paint pictures of a tremendous vision of what God is calling people to in the world. These are the 4 tools. We're going to work as pastors, as theologians, as worship leaders, and as prophets. We're going to work on problems, we're going to make points, we're going to offer prayers, and we're going to paint pictures. And when we do that, people are going to hear the voice of God.